In this video, I'm going to tell you why you should learn to Zenithal your miniatures and make them instantly look better. One of the first things that I had to learn early on in my miniature painting was this. It generally doesn't look good if you just block paint the model. What I mean by block painting is something like just painting the pants, just green and the shirt just blue, for example, right? Like you can start there, but then you need to accentuate the highlights and the shadows on the model with lighter and darker paint. You can't just let the natural lighting of the room do the job for you, even though you might think you can. If you do, then the miniature generally comes out looking flat. So why is this? Well, it has something to do with the nature of light and how our eyes, see light. Miniatures are kind of too small to get the proper benefits of natural light, the highlights and the shadows that come from, miniatures being three-dimensional objects, just really small ones. If you weren't painting Space Marines, for example, that were like, the standard kind of 1.5 inches tall, but instead you were painting Space Marines that were 7 feet tall, then you wouldn't have to worry about highlights and shadows on your model. The natural light would do its job. Luckily, we're not collecting and painting 7-foot tall miniatures. First of all, I don't know that you could even call them miniatures at that point, right? Secondly, minis that big would require an amazing amount of paint, which would be very expensive, and also a really huge brush, which would also be kind of expensive. And I can't even imagine the battle foam bag I would need to carry my army. So, since we're luckily painting tiny little mans instead, then we generally need to add highlights and shadows to the models, even simple ones, to just make the minis look less flat and make their details stand out. You may have run into this problem on your own miniatures and wondered why they look a bit flat and featureless on the tabletop. It's kind of like when you were coloring in coloring books as a kid, or, as an adult. I know it's a hobby for grown-ups too. And you just kind of like colored in a solid color into each different space. You stayed within the lines, but it didn't look as good as your classmates' coloring, where they stayed within the lines, but also added shading to the sections that made sense, right? Thereby kind of making the 2D image on the page look more three-dimensional. So you have to figure out how to paint the miniature and then paint it again with brighter colors in the areas that should be highlights and darker colors in the areas that, should be shadows. Kind of sounds like a real hassle, right? Well, it is, actually, and it's generally how the pros do it. Now, that said, there's a pretty simple trick that can go from showing you where the highlights and shadows should be on the model to actually doing the heavy lifting and easily putting the highlights and shadows on the model for you. The technique is generally called Zenithal, or Zenithal priming, or Zenithal highlighting, but it's all about the zenith, right? Zenithal means of, relating to, or located at or near the zenith. And the zenith basically means light coming from directly above. The zenith is the highest point, right? Something like that. Usually when you step outside, you are lit from above, the sky. Therefore, that's how we generally expect to see things lit. This also is how we expect to see our little warriors lit on the tabletop as well. Most battles are fought outside, but even when they're not, like they're in a Space Hulk or something like that, you still expect Zenithal lighting. So the easy process for making your models lit from above is to paint that Zenithal highlight right from the beginning when you're first priming and base coating your model. Rather than like priming your model just white or just black, or just starting with like a flat color, let's say red armor on a Blood Angel, for example, and then having to paint in the shadows and stuff later, you can just paint all that in right at the beginning. And you can use a dry brush, a rattle can, or my personal favorite, an airbrush, to make the job really quick. Some people think that this is a waste of time, especially if you're the type of painter that paints their base coats in mostly opaque colors. If you're painting the base coats opaque, then why do the Zenithal at the beginning? You're just going to eventually, cover that coat with the opaque colors as you go. Well, a lot of painters kind of like having that white to black layer on the model as a reference to show them, where the shadows will be as they go and paint and add in all the colors and stuff like that, for instance. Also, if the deepest recesses are very dark from the original, layer of going black before you did then white, then you don't have to paint them all as you paint with your opaque colors. If the entire model is just primed white, then every little nook and cranny has to have some paint in it, otherwise you'll have a white shadow coming out of the deep recesses, which will look weird. I'm lucky enough to know a lot of very fancy, award-winning miniature painters, and I've watched them paint over the years in person, and almost all of them start from a very simple white to black Zenithal prime. Even if they're going to, cover every square millimeter of the model with opaque paint eventually, they still generally start with a Zenithal, very frequently because they don't just want the light source to be directly coming down from above, right? But sometimes instead they have a very specific idea about where the light is coming from on that model. It's kind of part of the art in the presentation, so they work it into the original Zenithal. But me, I'm a tabletop painter, and I suspect many of you folks here watching this channel are as well. You just want to get decent looking models on the table to play games with, right? Me too. In this situation, using a Zenithal can make great strides in getting your paint job done quicker and also making it look better. And it's very simple to do. Like I said earlier, you can do it with a dry brush, a rattle can, or an airbrush, and I made a video about each a few years back. Pachow. But once you have that part done, then you're doing most of the heavy lifting with transparent paints. Back in 2019, Games Workshop came out with a new kind of paint which they called contrast paints. You were supposed to prime your model white or light gray or ivory, and then paint most of the parts with these transparent paints, which would stain the models to color them, but then also kind of collect in the recesses and crevices to darken those areas, and then allegedly they also pulled away from the pointy bits to add in some highlights. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, depends on the color. But it becomes a one-coat solution, at least in theory. You didn't have to worry about shadows and even highlights much because the contrast paints were supposed to handle it. My first tests looked terrible. Shortly after I started messing with those paints, a friend of mine told me that he had tried the contrast paints over a white to black Zenithal prime. He painted an orc and used the green contrast on the skin, and it looked really great. And he said it took him very little time at all. That was the trick. The same reasons I had been underpainting my models with, white to black Zenithal in the past. Here's a really old Pachow. It was the same reason to do it with these new contrast paints. When put over white, the colors kind of looked too samey as far as like light and dark, right? And a little bubblegummy. I don't know if that makes any sense. Over a Zenithal, though, you really started to get some drama. The biggest thing that people don't realize, I think, is how much a Zenithal prime can really pop the details of your models. When your models are just primed a single color, like just black or just white, or even, like as I mentioned before, a single color for the color of the overall model, then the tiny little micro details in the model have a tendency to get lost because everything's the same color. But when you have two contrasting colors, a dark overall undercoat and then a lighter coat applied from above to simulate the light source coming from the zenith, then details pop. I generally do a white over black Zenithal when either I'm not yet sure what colors I'm going to use on the model, right? It kind of gives me a base kind of black and white version of the model that I can then color in using transparent paints. I use Army Painter speed paints over my Zenithal primes these days because I like the way they work. There's like nearly 90 colors to choose from, which is great. And also they're in dropper bottles, which I prefer because they don't spill and they don't really dry out and all that kind of stuff. It's a fast and fun process and makes you look like you're a better painter, in my opinion, because you get to put a single color over the light to dark, and it makes it look like you put like light green all the way down to dark green, but you just actually put on one, coat of speed paint and boom. But what if you know what color most of the miniature you'll be working on is going to be? Should you just kind of spray it that color all over and then start adding in the shadows and the highlights and everything later? You could, but you could also just prime the miniature a dark color, like black or maybe dark brown, something like that, and then do a Zenithal spray or dry brush, or however you like to do it, of the main color. I wanted to do these Halo Flashpoint miniatures in an all-over kind of military green color, so I primed them black first, and then sprayed them from above with Army Painter Air Militia Green. And then I even highlighted them a little bit with Army Painter Air Army Green as well. This certainly pops out all of the little micro details all over the model and adds a light source from above as well. After I get back from Nova Open in Washington, D.C., where I am as of the publishing of this video, I'll be able to use a regular brush to pick out some of the differently colored details like the joints, and then the visors and the guns, paint the bases, and these models will be done and look great. Any kind of model that's mostly going to be like one color, from, Space Marines to weird-looking wizards to technological abominations, they can all benefit from this technique. It's even a good idea to use on vehicles. The Zenithal color scheme of painting the vehicle dark first and then whatever the lighter base color is afterwards allows all of the little undercuts and micro details on the model to stand out due to the shadows that you've kind of painted in during the priming process. This process even works on terrain as well. I always prime my terrain black or dark brown first, and then do a Zenithal spray of the base color over the top of that. It brings out all the details in the terrain and adds even more three-dimensionality as well. So, though it generally adds another step to the beginning of your miniature paint job process, creating a Zenithal prime or Zenithal base coat really helps the look of your models as you go forward. It makes the details stand out more, it adds highlights and shading to your models, and it's just a good habit to get into. Do you use a Zenithal theme kind of to your miniatures, or do you think that it's a waste of time and effort? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you like this video and want more like it on the channel, please hit the like button. It's free and makes sometimes little fireworks and stuff like that. If you want to see more videos like this every single Friday, while you're down there, also hit the subscribe button. It's also free. Thanks for watching.